start. Thank you again for coming on to this clinical excellence program, which has been initiated by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. As you're all aware, this is an attempt to really train doctors even up to the rural level or at the primary health level. And the aim is to develop regional and state centers of excellence using the topics that we've discussed, and hopefully then the center of excellence will be able to reach out to all the doctors both in the private and in the public sector to really develop a strategy which is homogeneous as far as treatment for COVID-19 is concerned. We've been having these meetings every day. The last 2 days, except for the weekend, we discussed mild COVID, and now today we are planning to discuss convalescent plasma. Before I really go on to that, I would really request a brief comments from the ministry side, from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Govind Jaiswal, Director Public Health. Love sir is busy in some briefing in Cabinet Secretary. So I welcome all of you, and especially Dr. Guleria sir for his valuable time and despite a busy schedule. Last 2 days, last 2 sessions sir, that we attended. As a actually participant number was quite increasing, and yesterday also it was almost 3,000 participants from across the states, sir. And everybody has raised certain question, and we are compiling the questions, sir. And once we'll prepare the answer, that we will send to state. And the state officer who are participating here, we already requested to them prepare an action plan. So whatever information has been gathered and has been given here by the panelists, it should be disseminated to all the PSC, CSC, and all the clinical physicians who are involved in the COVID-19. So that for that we have been requested to all the state health secretary, and once the action plan is ready, it is request to please submit to us also. Thank you, sir. Now over to Guleria, sir.
Thank you very much. So I think that is important that we have an action plan in place. Also, all the queries that have come, we can convert them into FAQs and then distribute that, and the regional and state centers can even make these FAQs in their regional language, which will also be useful for people to be able to sort of understand. So today we are discussing another topic which has been controversial, to say the least, and that is convalescent plasma. We've moved on from a huge hype as far as convalescent plasma was concerned last year, with a lot of interest in it from the point of view of opening plasma banks and doing a lot, to a number of trials coming up, including RCTs and a trial from India itself, not showing that much of a benefit. And therefore, it's very important for people to understand what is the position of convalescent plasma and what do we really mean by convalescent plasma. Plasma from a person who has recovered from COVID-19 need not be convalescent plasma. You have to understand what is the convalescent plasma which you can give to a patient, what is the timing, when is it actually useful, because studies have shown that if you give it late, and this one study I remember from the Netherlands, which when they were looking at giving convalescent plasma late, they looked at the antibody level in patients in whom they were planning to give convalescent plasma, and it was very high. It was higher than what they would have got from giving the plasma itself. So it's important to understand that it's useful in the stage where the body's own antibodies have not been formed. Once a good, robust antibody response had occurred by the patient himself, the convalescent plasma may have limited role. But I'll ask Dr. Hem Chandra Pandey, who is basically a faculty in the Department of Transfusion Medicine, to really discuss the topic in detail, and then we can have questions. I also have Dr. Neeraj Nischal from the medicine department, who is also looking after COVID patients as a faculty. So we'll first have a brief talk, and then we can have a discussion. So over to Dr. Hem Chandra Pandey.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. I'll share my screen and so that everyone can have a look. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So I'll just share the outline. I'll talk about one slide about history, then what is convalescent plasma, what is its composition, then how do we select a donor for convalescent plasma, then what all tests are required to characterize the convalescent plasma before it can be given, and how does it act, because that is important to identify at which stage we should be using this convalescent plasma. Then safety and efficacy, that is the evidence which has been generated over the past 1 year. And in today's scenario where vaccination is occurring, what is the how do we collect, or from whom do we collect, and whether vaccinated people can donate convalescent plasma or not. So to start with, as we see, serum therapy is not a new therapy. It was the oldest therapy which was used even in the 19th century. From 1890 till today, we are actually using this serum therapy. Earlier, it was known as serum therapy. So in 1890s, it was found that specific antibodies can protect against bacteria and toxins. So it was not the viruses which were considered at that time. It was considered that bacteria and toxins can be dealt with the use of serum therapy. So during 1890 to 1935, it gained usage for infectious diseases, and very good benefits were acquired by use of serum therapy. Then there was discovery of sulfonamide antimicrobial, followed by beta-lactam antibiotics during the period from 1935 to 1940s, and serum therapy was abundant at that time. The reason being, antibiotics were more useful in both early stages and as well as in the late stages. And serum therapy was considered to be effective only in the early stage, as Guleria sir just told just before this seminar. He told everyone. So during this period, then again from 1960s, a specific immunoglobulin started to be explored for treating diseases or other conditions. Followed by monoclonal antibodies in 1975 by the discovery of hybridoma technology. Then in 1998, palivizumab was licensed for RSV diseases. I'm just talking about monoclonal antibodies which were used for infectious diseases. Other monoclonal antibodies were discovered before this, but palivizumab was first licensed for respiratory syncytial virus diseases. And from 2000 onwards, various monoclonal antibodies were licensed for infectious diseases, and serum therapy for influenza, Ebola, MERS, and other outbreaks was also tried during this period. So before we landed with COVID-19, a lot of experience was there with respect to other infectious outbreaks during this last 20 years. Now coming to what is convalescent plasma, as we already know that plasma which is obtained from a patient who has recovered from a disease. So in our case, a person who has recovered from COVID-19 and contains antibodies specific to this particular disease. However, in addition to this antibodies specific to COVID-19, the plasma will contain clotting factors and other anti-clotting factors. Then it will have anti-inflammatory cytokines. It will have protein C and S. It may have other factors like soluble ACE2 receptors, complement, defensins, and other things. And in addition, as usual, plasma will have albumin. So not all plasma recovered from the convalescent donors can be classified as convalescent plasma. There are certain requirements which need to be met to classify it as convalescent plasma. So what are those requirements? Firstly, there has to be presence of antibodies which are specific to microbe, that is presence of COVID-19 antibodies. They may be IgG antibodies or they may be neutralizing antibodies. We'll come to this discussion in the later part of the slides. Then it should have sufficient quantity of those antibodies. That is, the titer of antibodies is another concern which needs to be looked into. Then it should be given in early course of the disease. So this would define the time period or the patient groups which needs to be given this therapy. In addition to these three requirements, it should lag the infectious particle. We should not be collecting it much earlier in the course of convalescence, because then there is a chance that we may introduce another strain or the viral particles into the patient's body. Then it has to be safe and there has to be a known efficacy of this particular treatment. So the first point, that is antibody specific to microbe, will define how we select a plasma donor. The titer will be, we can classify the antibodies after defining the titer as high titer or low titer, and we'll come into the later slides regarding this point. And patient group can be classified whether we can give it to mild or moderate or severe disease, and what are the other patient characters which may influence the use of this particular therapy. Now, this plasma can be obtained from two different sources. One, the plasma may be separated from whole blood like we do in blood banks. We can collect blood from the donor who has recovered beyond a certain time period from COVID-19 and separate the plasma from this whole blood. The red cells can be used for red cell transfusion and the plasma can be used as convalescent plasma. So this approach was adopted during the first wave by the state of Gujarat and West Bengal by their state blood transfusion council, and it is possible to use this kind of plasma without the need of special equipment like cell separator. However, the most commonly used plasma during the first wave or during the second wave was plasma which was collected using the cell separator, and this was also collected from COVID-19 recovered donors, and most of the cities in India actually utilize this technique by cell separator, and even ICMR trial, that is the PLACID trial, used plasma separated using cell separator. So in cell separator, the donor will be connected to an equipment that is called as apheresis equipment or the cell separator. Whole blood will go into the cell separator where it will be centrifuged at high speeds. The plasma separated is collected into a blood bag and rest of the cellular components are returned to the patient. So the cell separator collected plasma gives advantage over the whole blood collected plasma in the sense that the donor can donate again after a certain period of time, which we'll discuss later. And only the plasma is separated, the donor does not become anemic, the red cells are returned to the blood donor. Whereas from whole blood, it is easily scalable at even rural places because there are blood banks available even at peripheries, and not everyone is having a cell separator. So both of them have advantage depending on what scenario we are talking about. Now coming to the selection of plasma donors, this is very important because the quality of plasma is something which will define its outcome. So all the plasma donors, whether we are collecting from whole blood or whether we are collecting using a cell separator, required to fulfill blood donation criteria or apheresis donation criteria as per our country's regulations. In this, our regulations regarding convalescent plasma have been that we are not taking multivirus female donors because they are considered to have anti-HLA antibodies and they may lead to a condition called transfusion-related acute lung injury or other complications. Then the donors have to pass through a health questionnaire based on which we identify donors which may be of risk to the recipient or to themselves. Then they have to undergo a physical examination. They have to be fit in all the respects. Apart from that, we do a complete blood count where hemoglobin needs to be about 12.5, platelet count has to be over 1,50,000, and WBCs have to be within normal limit. There is a strict weight requirement because the total blood volume used for plasmapheresis is calculated by this. So the weight has to be above 50 kgs and there has to be good presence of good antigubital veins in the donor who is going to donate the plasma. This is required because in apheresis equipment or cell separator, the blood flow needs to be really good for separation, as well as the blood has to be returned back to the donor, and poor veins may lead to discontinuation of the procedure in between. Apart from them, these blood donors need to be tested for transfusion transmitted infections as usual for the blood donations in our country. Apart from this, there are certain additional criteria as far as COVID-19 is concerned. So these donors have to have a confirmed COVID-19 positive RT-PCR report, because unless we are sure that the antibodies which we are detecting are due to infection, they are of no use to the patient. There are instances where some cross-reactive antibodies due to homology with other coronaviruses make the test positive when we are screening for these antibodies. So we need to have a confirmed COVID-19 positive RT-PCR report. Then our guidelines or the NBTC guidelines say that the donor has to have a 28 days, has to complete a 28 days after discharge or 28 days after end of home isolation. So nowadays we are ending the home isolation at 10 days or 2-day symptom-free interval. So 28 days should have passed when anyone from recovered disease come to us for blood donation. Then our regulations say that total proteins should be above 6 gram per DL even on the first plasma donation. Then there have to be presence of COVID-19 antibodies, and they have to have a certain titer. We will come to those titers in the later slides. And if somebody is transfused with convalescent plasma when he was ill, he has to defer for 1 year or 12 months as per our regulation. So there are no relaxations on these criteria as far as our guidelines are concerned. Now, if the donor is giving plasma using cell separator, repeat donation after 2 weeks is allowed with total plasma volume not to exceed 1 liter or 1000 ml in a month. Now, what is the ideal time to collect? Because if we collect too early, there may not be formation of antibodies. Like I said, there has to be a 28-day period. There are two main reasons behind it. One, first, the plasma may be infected at that time. The donor may not have recovered completely, and there are chances that we may collect plasma when already there are some COVID viral particles in the plasma of the donor. So we have to give sufficient time, and that time is generally double the incubation period of the virus. So as COVID has a 14-day incubation period, we defer them for 28 days. Secondly, the antibodies will take some time to develop. Generally, at 14 days of the disease, and IgG antibodies start developing, although IgM antibodies would have developed at 7 to 10 days, but IgG antibodies start developing at 14 days, and to reach a certain titer, we require some amount of time. So for that time to be sufficient, a 28 days interval was decided. There are certain studies, which one of which I am discussing, have also looked into this aspect. So if you can see here, the proportion of people who have certain antibodies is shown on the y-axis, and the days after onset of symptom is shown on the x-axis. So here we can see that at the proportion of individuals which were seropositive at 150 days, that is 5 months interval, was very less, although for IgG SRBD antigen, the antibodies were present almost in everyone. However, other antibodies have declined. So viral neutralization antibodies were present only in around 60% or 50% of the individuals at 5 months interval. So a time interval of around 60 days is considered to be the best, because all the three antibodies will be present in almost everyone at that time period. Now, if we see separate these antibodies and the titer, so we can see that viral neutralization titers above 160 or equivalent titers of RBD and ectodomin antibodies were started declining from around 30 days, and at the end of 60 days, the titers were high in only around 80% of the individuals, or 80% of the recovered patients. After that, the viral neutralization titers decrease very steeply. So even if we see the RBD, IgG and IgM titers, again, a time period of 60 days is good enough so that a number of individuals can be identified and plasma collected. So 60 days, 28 days to 60 days post recovery is considered to be the ideal time to collect the plasma. However, if the donor has come in the later time period, the chances of having low titer antibodies will be more, but we can always try to see whether titer is less or not, it's in case there is paucity of blood donors or plasma donors. Now, the titers have a relation with donor age as well as the disease severity. So if we see the effect of age, if the age group is 20 to 30, the decline in antibodies is very fast. However, if the age group is above 60, the decline in antibodies is relatively less. Most of our blood donors are although in the young age group, so we need to have a sufficient time period where the antibody decline is less. So again, this time period also for all three, that is the neutralization antibodies, IgG antibodies and IgM antibodies, was found to be around 60 days. Similarly, disease severity, if the disease is less severe, that is the score is 1, 2 or 3, the antibody titer started falling early, whereas if the disease severity is 4 or 5, the antibody titer remains stable for longer time periods or till a period of around 5 months. So again, here if we see a time period of 60 days is sufficient, and at that time period, most of the individuals will retain these antibodies. So 28 days to 60 days is the ideal time period to collect these the plasma, so that high titer plasma is obtained. Beyond that, the titer starts falling, and another hint to collect plasma is from people who are older age as well as where disease severity was higher, because they'll be maintaining this plasma even beyond 60 days, and we may utilize them for multiple plasma collections. Now, after vaccination, concern has occurred whether we can collect plasma from vaccinated individuals or not. So convalescent plasma can be collected from vaccinated individuals if they were infected with SARS-CoV-2 at least once. So they need to have a natural infection, as the antibody profile resulting solely from vaccination has not been sufficiently studied. We don't know what will be the quality of antibodies from vaccinated donors if they didn't have a natural infection. So vaccinated individuals with COVID-19 infections were reported to have high titer of antibodies, including the neutralizing antibodies. And it was suggested that vaccines boost the immune response, which was gained from the natural infection. So people who are just vaccinated, we should refrain collecting plasma from such plasma donors. Now, what are the tests which are available for screening of COVID-19 antibodies and titration and their titration? So, if we look at the virus, there are four components of the virus, that is membrane protein, nucleocapsid protein, spike protein, and envelope protein, for which antigenic response is seen in our body. The main proteins which are considered for screening these COVID-19 plasma donors is the spike protein and nucleocapsid protein to a certain extent. So these assays towards identifying antibodies to these two proteins have been of particular importance in screening COVID-19 donors. So the tests which are directed for screening are directed mainly towards S1S2 and RBD, and these are preferred. However, anti-nucleocapsid antibody detection assays are also suitable, and both ELISA-based as well as chemiluminescence-based platforms are available to do screening. Initially, in the first wave, these tests were not easily available. However, now most of the blood banks or most of the higher centers have these tests available with them. The second is the titration. So ideally, viral neutralization titers have to be done, and they have to be done using the functional assays. These functional assays are either plaque reduction neutralization tests or the microcytotoxicity neutralization test, and they are possible only in BSL-3 labs. However, since BSL-3 labs are not that easy, and the test they are labor intensive, as well as the test take time around 2 to 3 days to come, it was not possible to screen these or to do titration of all the collected plasma using these PRNT or MNT based tests. But surrogate neutralization assay based tests are also available nowadays, which are actually using ELISA platform, and there are now guidelines where these surrogate neutralization assay values equivalent to the assays of these neutralization assays is available. Then as I already said, the threshold of the screening test, which is equivalent to the viral neutralization titers above a specific titer, is now available. So let us first see the Indian guidelines which were there for the titration of plasma, regarding the titration of plasma. So if we see the ICMR advisory, which was dated 17th November 2020, the IgG antibodies using ELISA against COVID-19 with a titer of 1:640 was accepted. Then if the platform is chemiluminescence, 13 absorbance unit per ml was accepted as sufficient titer, or if PRNT or MNT based assays were used, then an antibody titer of 80 was sufficient to classify it as high titer. These guidelines were recently modified, and the clinical guidance for management of adult COVID-19 patients released by AIIMS ICMR COVID-19 National Task Force says that high titer donor plasma can be classified if the plasma gives a signal to cutoff ratio greater than 3.5 or equivalent, which is depending on the test kit being used. So just to make it or refine it more, the threshold to classify high titer plasma based on immunoassays have been more elaborated by US FDA in their letter of authorization dated March 9, 2021. So there are a number of manufacturers. I have tried to gather those manufacturers which are commonly available in our country. So we have Abbott, we have GenScript assay, we have Ortho, Ross, and Siemens, for which particular assays and their qualifying result, which qualify the plasma as high titer plasma, is being listed here. So as you can see, we at our place, we actually used Abbott assay on Architect platform, and qualifying result, if the signal cutoff in this particular assay is 4.5 or above, we can classify that plasma as high titer plasma. Similarly, we also utilized GenScript assay in the initial phase of the pandemic when PRNT was not easily available, and we took an inhibition of 50% because we took 80% of viral neutralization as the criteria at that time based on ICMR guidelines, and our study said that an inhibition of 50% or more is equivalent to 80 neutralization titer. However, now US FDA has classified the high titers as more than 160 titers. So a 68% inhibition in this particular assay will classify the plasma as high titer. So depending on the equipment which one is using, they can classify their plasma as high titer or low titer without the requirement for utilizing the neutralization assays. Now, before I go on to who can receive this plasma, I would like to discuss more in detail about the possible mechanism of action of this convalescent plasma. So we all know that the SARS-CoV enters into our cells utilizing the ACE2 receptor on the host cells and the spike protein on its surface. So the viral neutralization assays actually try to address this particular part of the viral entry. Now, the first mechanism, there are multiple mechanisms which are hypothesized. So first mechanism is the viral neutralization using the antibodies which are there in the plasma. So if the virus is in circulation, these neutralizing antibodies from CCP will actually bind to the surface of the virus, and they will actually block the binding of the virus to the ACE2 receptor. So this is considered to be the main mechanism behind the convalescent plasma. However, the neutralization test which we are actually using to classify CCP into high titer and low titer and to find the presence of neutralizing antibodies actually looks into this particular hypothesis. The second hypothesis is antibody dependent virolysis, where the antibodies present in the plasma activate the complement pathway, and the complement pathway leads to a membrane attack complex in the viral cell membrane, and this will lead to virolysis of the virus. The third mechanism is antibody-mediated presentation of the antigen. So these antibodies will bind to the antigens of the virus, which will be presented to the antigen-presenting cells, and this will help in activating the T helper cells or activating or stimulating the T cell pathway of, which is responsible for cellular immunity. The fourth mechanism which were hypothesized was the antibody-dependent cell cytotoxicity. So in this, these cells which are expressing the host cells which are expressing the viral antigens will be bound by the antibodies, and the natural killer cells will identify them, and they will program them for apoptosis, leading to death of those cells. So these are four different mechanisms which have been hypothesized for functioning or for mechanism of action of convalescent plasma. However, if you look carefully, all these four mechanisms involve the presence of viral particle in the body. So now, what is the ideal time period for use? If we see the staging of the illness, we see that it is classified into three stages. Stage 1 is the early infection, stage 2 is the pulmonary phase, and stage 3 is the hyperinflammation phase. So the stage 1 is one which is actually targeted by this convalescent plasma, because as we require viral particles to be present, as it acts on the viral particles or on the virus. So viral response phase is the ideal phase where we should be giving convalescent plasma. So ideally, this has to be given within 7 days of symptom onset. And why not give in the late phase where host inflammatory response is there? Because there would already be an endogenous antibody response which starts in 8 to 10 days with IgM antibodies, and it reaches to a peak to around 2 to 3 weeks with the start of IgG antibodies at 14 days. Secondly, in the later phases, the manifestations are mainly due to inflammation, which are not considered to be addressed by convalescent plasma. So the best responses should have been obtained in the early phase of the disease. Now, what are the pre-transfusion requirements? Now we know that what is convalescent plasma, how do we characterize it, and what phase we should be giving it. But what are the requirements and what is the dose? So in our country, currently in our country as well as in other countries, it is either emergency use authorization or the off-label use. And since it is emergency use authorization or off-label use, we need to take informed consent form. We need to have a request form as we have for all the blood components. Then we need to know the blood group of the patients. If the blood group is not known, we need to do the blood group using an EDTA sample. So ideally, most of the countries or most of the trials which are there have utilized around 200 to 250 ml of this high titer plasma, which is transfused over a period of around 2 hours. That is, it is transfused very slowly. And if we have to see which group plasma to be given to which group, ideally AB plasma can be given to all the blood groups because it is a neutral plasma, and respective groups need to be given respective plasma. So if a person is O group, he or she can receive any group plasma that is O, AB, A or B. So these are the request form which we devised for our own institute in the initial part of the pandemic, which we are using. And this is an example of consent form which we developed during the initial phase of the convalescent plasma program. Now, since it was a new therapy which was used for the COVID-19 disease, and the experience was not there for COVID-19 disease, so the safety of CCP transfusion was something which was very important. So one risk is there, which is inherited and which is present for all plasma transfusion. So the risk of routine plasma transfusion was already there, and this risk may include the risk of transfusion transmitted infection like HIV, HBV, HCV, or any other unknown infections, allergic reactions, including anaphylactic reactions, TRALI, TECO, etc. However, when we look at risk specific to administration of plasma, which is reaching these antibodies to COVID-19, the transfusion reactions were seen to be less than 1%. The thromboembolic complications after use of this plasma was less than 1%, and the cardiac events were found to be in approximately 3% of the patients which were transfused. And this data was obtained from a very large trial in the US, that is Mayo Clinic, where 20,000 transfusions were assessed and the rates of the transfusion reactions were found out. These two side effects, that is the thromboembolic complications and cardiac events, were considered not to be related to the transfusion of CCP. Apart from that, there is a theoretical risk of antibody-dependent enhancement. Here, if the amount of antibodies is low, they'll bind to the virus, they'll protect the virus from body's immune system, and the disease severity will be more as the virus escapes the immune response due to low level of neutralizing antibodies. This was mainly seen with dengue infections, but there was a theoretical possibility of this particular phenomena in case of CCP transfusion. However, despite transfusion of so many units of plasma throughout the world, there are no cases which are reported till now. So transfusion of CCP was considered to be safe. Now, what about the efficacy of this particular therapeutic product? If we see, I've tried to list out a few of the randomized controlled trials. Apart from that, I have actually listed one observational study by Joyner et al. So the first 6 are RCTs, and the last one is an observational study. There are so many observational studies, there are so many case control studies. I have not included them, I have only included RCTs. So if we see, most of these RCTs have not found any use of CCP and change in patient mortality, hospital stay or disease stay. So they are in chronological order in which they were published. So first was Garberin et al., where the number of patients was 86. So they found there is no difference between mortality, hospital stay, and day 15 disease severity. However, this trial was stopped prematurely, and they found that 80% of their patients already had anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. So this trial in this patient selection was quite late, where patient had already formed antibodies, and to this extent that both the patient as well as donor had similar titer of antibodies, that is 160. The second titer was also stopped early, where they found that 0 to 14% patients progressed to death or mechanical ventilation in plasma and controlled arm. So they found that there is a difference between patients who received plasma and who did not receive plasma, both for mechanical ventilation or death. And their mortality rates were 0 to 9.3 at day 15. So, however, here also they found that there are 49.4% patients which had antibodies at enrollment. So, they could actually enroll less than 30% of their planned target population, and it was not considered statistically significant because they could not enroll more than 70% of their planned target. Now, the third study was from our own country, that is the PLACID trial, where a total of 464 patients were assessed, and the study also concluded that there is no association of CCP with reduction in mortality. As you can see, 13.6% patient had mortality in intervention arm as compared to 14.6% in control arm. and it also didn't prevent it progression to severe disease. However, there was our median antibody titer used in the study was 40. So it was not even beyond the 80 titer, which is actually prescribed in our own guidelines. The main problem with our trial was that initially we didn't have means to assess the donors before we have collected plasma. So this was not associated with reduction in any mortality. However, it was associated with earlier resolution of symptoms and decrease in O2 requirement. And even in our trial where the patients were assessed for neutralizing antibodies, 83% of patients had neutralizing antibodies at enrollment. Then another trial by Lipster et al., where they actually tested it on elderly patients greater than 65 years of age, and they included mild disease patients. So they found that there is a significant difference between the trial arm and the placebo arm. So 16% versus 31% patients experienced severe disease. So patients who were transfused with convalescent plasma experienced, lesser patients experienced severe disease, and there was a dose-dependent response with respect to outcome in their trial. Another trial was Simonovich trial, where mild to moderately ill patients were assessed or were enrolled, and again they did not find any evidence of decrease or increase in mortality using CP and controls. Another trial, that is the UK recovery trial, where around 11,558 patients were given convalescent plasma, and there was no restriction of age group in that trial. They also didn't find any difference even with high titer convalescent plasma, which also did not improve survival. Then the last one was the Mayo Mayo Clinic study, where Joyner et al. Gave plasma to around 35,322 patients. But this was an observational study. Here they took adults with risk of severe or life-threatening disease. So either the adults were having severe or life-threatening disease, or they were having risk of severe or life-threatening disease. So they find that there is less mortality if the plasma is given within 3 days of diagnosis. That is 9% versus 12% 7-day mortality. Again, they also found that there is less mortality if high titer plasma is given. That is 9% versus 12 versus 14 7-day mortality in high titer, moderate titer, or low titer groups. So all in all, we can conclude that it is still recommended as an off-label treatment because there are very contradicting results from different trials. However, it is clear that it has no use in moderate or severe disease. Even the mechanism of actions or the principle behind the use of convalescent plasma does not favor the use in late stage where moderate or severe disease is generally found. However, cautious use during early phase, that is 7 days of symptom onset, that too in patients with comorbidities, immunocompromised patients, and if the patients are tested seronegative for anti-SARS-CoV-2, is recommended or may be tried. Then this, if it is used indiscriminately, it has been shown that it is associated with evolution of variants in few cases, like the one reported recently in Nature, where immunocompromised patient developed variants post CCP transfusion. So we need to be very careful when we are using this particular therapy in immunocompromised patients. Now, what about pregnancy in pediatric patients? Most of the trials which I mentioned or are in publication does not include pregnant females or pediatric patients into this trial, mainly because the number of patients who are pregnant and COVID-19 positive was less initially, and pediatric patients are not having that severe disease in the initial phase of the pandemic. So there is limited data on effectiveness in pregnancy. There are few case reports and few ongoing RCTs. In pediatric patients, again, there are no high quality studies, and available reports in pediatric A's are just case reports and case series. So these two patient groups still needs to be assessed. However, the principles which I have discussed may apply to these patients group as well. What about CCP against variants? The use of CCP against variants. Again, the experience regarding use of CCP against variant is very limited. However, few case reports or few case series have said that it is very less effective against variant, especially if the variant is against the spike protein. So there are, if you can search, there are two case reports in the PubMed where you can see that neutralizing antibodies where the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein variants escape the neutralizing antibodies in both these instances. So to summarize, convalescent plasma looked a promising approach for COVID-19 treatment, Over time, however, the evidence has gathered, and the evidence suggests that there is very minimal response in late stage of the disease. There is a benefit if given early, especially within 3 days of symptom onset. However, more studies needs to be done on this aspect, and further evidence is required. And only high titer plasma units should be transfused, for which there are now much clearer guidelines. And despite all these things, donor selection and availability of these blood donors need to be refined in our country. The number of donors which are available and the number of patients which have been treated for this disease is disproportionate. So we need to come out with some approaches as to how to arrange these donors and reduce and increase the availability of plasma if we are going to treat these patients in early phase. So thank you. I now invite everyone to have questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pandey. And I think an excellent talk highlighting the importance of convalescent plasma, but also showing the challenges that we have and what its exact position. It is a therapy which has had a lot of controversies. It's not something new, as has already been shown. It's been used for over 100 years. Even during the Ebola outbreak, there was a lot of data which was emerging for use of convalescent plasma because no therapy was available. There are a number of questions in the chat box. Before I ask Dr. Hemchandra Pandey to answer them, I'll just ask Neeraj to give a little bit of a practical sort of experience, because we have been using convalescent plasma in our patients also in the early stage. The data is not that strong, but like most centers in early patients with mild disease, we do tend to use it. So Neeraj, if you can just give your comments, and then we can have the question answers.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So what we have observed that, as Dr. Hemchand rightly pointed out, indiscriminate use of plasma, especially in those patients who have become very sick, who are in frank cytokine storm, it's not going to help. And that is what we have observed, that those patients who are on ventilator, very sick, and there is possibility of cytokine storm actually taking over, those patients usually do not benefit from plasma therapy. And in fact, they may actually worsen in form of pulmonary edema and other problems. So the exact role of plasma, which we believe in whatever limited experience we have in our setup, is that if it is given in the early part of disease when patient is just requiring oxygen and with comorbidities and a good plasma with good titers of antibody, that these are the patients who will actually benefit, if any, from use of convalescent plasma. So we should not be using it in patients who are on ventilator as a last resort, as if this might work. I think that will be actually harming the patient more than doing any good. So what we believe that early part of moderate disease is the best group of patients which can actually benefit from use of plasma if the selection of plasma is right. Randomly taking plasma from patients, from the recovered patient may not be helpful. So these few aspects have to be kept into mind before advising for plasma therapy. Especially we are seeing social media platforms flooded with requests for plasma donation for patients who are very sick. So I don't think they are the right group of patients who are going to benefit, and we should try to minimize use of plasma in such group of patients.
Thank you. So now I think I'll ask Dr. Hemchandra to address the questions. And if you have some questions, you could also raise your hand and ask them. But there are also a number of questions on the chat box and on the Q&A. So we can even start with those.
Shall I start, sir?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so the first question is whether the plasma can be used in children. So I think I have already addressed this, that there are not much available for use in children, and generally they don't have that severe disease. But nowadays we are seeing more children with severe disease. Although it has, it may be used in trial mode if at all required. It may not be used routinely in children. Dr. Neeraj has any comments on this?
Perfectly fine. Children usually, most of them are doing fine. And since there is no data, and again, theoretical possibility translating into a clinical significance is again something which we have to take into account. It appears very promising that plasma will neutralize virus and everything will be fine, but actually that not materialize in clinical practice. So I think children should be kept out of this till we have data, and we should not be trying too much in them unless in a clinical trial setting.
So I agree with that. You see, we don't have data on safety and the efficacy data is not that strong. If this was a therapy which was very useful, one would say a risk-benefit analysis says that you should give it in children. Currently, we don't have data to show that it is that useful a treatment strategy that we should give it in children until we have more data. So I think we should be a little cautious as far as giving it in children are concerned. You could take the next question unless someone wants to ask it directly.
Yes. So the next question is from Dr. Chittaranjan Prasad. Is it important to transfuse RH compatible plasma? So when we are transfusing plasma, there is no concern about RH. Since we are not giving any cellular component, so we can give across the RH group. Like A positive patients can be given plasma from A negative, or A negative can be given plasma from A positive. The only thing which we need to keep in mind that we need to do an antibody titer for red cell antibodies, not for COVID antibodies. In addition to COVID antibodies, we should look for anti-D in Rh negative individuals, which may cause mild hemolysis or TCT positivity in these patients. So just to avoid that, we should be testing for antibody. We should be doing an antibody screening in these patients for red cell antibodies also, if the plasma is from negative donors. That's all.
Okay, we can, I think, go on to the next question.
Yes, sir. The next one is from Dr. Ashish Jain. The inflammatory markers like ferritin, IL-6 takes longer time to decrease. Is collection and transfusion CP in 28 days to 2 months from a donor leading to adverse outcome in patients because of these inflammatory markers? Sir, I don't think it would lead to any problem in a patient, because we are just giving 200 ml of plasma. That too, we are collecting after 28 days of recovery. So most likely this won't have any effect on the patient outcome, because this is not going to stimulate the patient to generate more of cytokines or inflammatory markers. So I really doubt whether this is applicable or not.
So these are inflammatory markers in the blood. They are not going to cause any effect as far as donation, the plasma is concerned. So I also agree with that. Neeraj, if you want to add anything, we can add on to that, but I would tend to agree that these are just markers present in the blood as markers rather than going ahead and causing inflammation in the person who is given the plasma.
Or again, sir, IL-6 will not persist for that long even in patients who have recovered. So I don't think that should be a problem. And I don't know what is the source of this information that IL-6 in such person are going to stay for prolonged duration. Usually once somebody recovers, these markers almost tends to come down to normal levels. Ferritin may continue to be raised, but that's not going to affect the outcome of the patient to best of our understanding.
Yes, and another thing just I'd like to add is IL-6 is not a specific marker for COVID. IL-6 would be raised in many other infective processes. If you were to look at IL-6 markers in your ICU in non-COVID patients, you may at times find markers which are much higher than what you're finding in COVID patients. There is a paper which has actually done that. And therefore, it's important to remember that a rise in IL-6 is not a marker to say that this is COVID infection. It is just a marker of an ongoing inflammatory response. We can go on to the next question, and if there are any questions which you want to ask directly, just raise your hand. I can see Ames Jodhpur wants to ask first question, so we'll take that first.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, two small points I would like to mention. First, just 200 ml of plasma containing antibodies, when it gets diluted in 5 liters of recipient blood. So because of dilution, the actual antibody titer will not be very high. So there is always doubt whether convalescent plasma is going to work. So it's a small comment. But even then, there is a recommendation, most probably by WHO, that the antibody titers should be 250, more than 250 from donor's blood. So would you recommend, even if we want to selectively try in some patient, would you advise that antibody titer should be measured from the donor blood? Because otherwise it will not work. Less than 250, probably it will not work. And the trials that was conducted by ICMR India the average titers were only 70 something. So that
Okay.
could be the major cause of failure of that trial.
Yeah. Sir, actually, the titers have to be considered what particular marker we are doing the titer against. There are two different kind of antibodies. One are binding antibodies and one are neutralizing antibodies. So these binding antibodies are S1, S2, RBD, which we generally look by using ELISA or chemiluminescence assay. And the other kind of antibodies are neutralizing antibodies. So the main effect of CCP is considered to be through the neutralizing antibodies which are there. And to see these titers, we have to do viral neutralization assays, either PRNT or MNT, which are not easily available. They have to be done in a BSL-3 lab because you need to deal with the live virus. They are not that easy to be adopted at the blood bank level where collection of this plasma is being done. So the threshold of these immunoassays or the binding antibodies, which is equivalent to the particular titer of neutralization antibodies, is being looked at, and what I showed in that table was the same thing. Those immunoassays, a particular titer in that immunoassay which corresponds to viral neutralization titer of 160 was considered to be high titer. So I don't know whether WHO is giving the titer for binding antibodies or neutralizing antibodies. Most likely that was for binding antibodies, because most of the RCTs or most of the recommendations are based on neutralization titer of 160 or something else. So majority of the studies have actually used a titer of 160 neutralization. So what we are doing is we are taking an equivalent titer of binding antibodies, which is equivalent to neutralization titer of 160. I hope I'm clear regarding this.
Okay, I think AFMC Pune also there is a question that the hand is raised. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. I had a question regarding the experience at All India Institute of Medical Sciences regarding the safety, because during the first peak, we administered COVID convalescent plasma to approximately 40 patients, and 3 of these patients within 12 hours had massive pulmonary embolism and had sudden deterioration. So we stopped using plasma thereafter. And these were patients who are having moderate disease. So we have collated our data as well, and it has been published. So what is your experience been regarding pulmonary embolism post plasma therapy? And that was immediately within 6 to 12 hours.
So maybe Neeraj can give some idea, because offhand I don't recollect that we are seeing a larger number of thromboembolic phenomena after convalescent plasma.
Yes, sir. So we had a few mortalities after a patient, especially the sick patient who received convalescent plasma, but that was not directly attributed to convalescent plasma. And of course, we have done MITs in such patients, and we are yet to find any significant thromboembolic complication in all those cases. So to best of our understanding, our patients do not had any of these patients who had received convalescent plasma and could not survive did not have any evidence of thromboembolism or any sort of this thing. So it could just be an isolated incidence in AFMC Pune, but at our center at the moment, we don't have such data to basically, in our minimal invasive tissue sampling samples, we hardly have any patients who have this type of problem.
Yeah, I would just like to sort of concur with that, and maybe one can do even a literature search. I don't think in the larger studies, trials that have been done of convalescent plasma, there's also a meta-analysis published, I think, in JAMA recently this year in February, which has also looked at the data, and the Mayo Clinic study also. Really, there has been no signal in terms of serious side effects that you mentioned in terms of thromboembolism. So whether it was related to the treatment or it happened incidentally is something that we need to understand. But I think it's important that if you have some such side effect, we monitor it more closely, just to make sure that is it a cause and effect or is it coincidental.
So the Mayo study had 3% thromboembolic complications, and they didn't attribute it to plasma transfusion.
Actually, it gets difficult at times because these patients are hypoxic, and to do a CTPA at that point in time to conclusively demonstrate becomes difficult. So in one of the patients, we were able to shift and do a CTPA. The rest of the 2 patients, we did a bedside echocardiography, which showed a RA-RV dilatation 6 to 12 hours post, in spite of the patient being on therapeutic anticoagulation.
Yeah, so pulmonary thromboembolism is known to occur otherwise also, as far as COVID-19 is concerned. It does cause a hypercoagulable state, and we've seen patients who dying because of both thromboembolic phenomena and bleeding from at various sites. Intra-abdominal bleed has been there in one patient who we were not able to save. 2 or 3 patients I remember, Neeraj may remember more, who had intracerebral hemorrhage. They're improving actually. We thought they had come out, and then suddenly they deteriorated and had a hemiparesis or neurodeficit, and then we found that they had had a massive bleed in the brain. So there are hematological problems that we do see in these patients, which are inherent to the disease itself. So anyone else has a question, or should we go back to the chat box?
A second question was regarding the timing of collection, because what I remember in the decision tree, it was mentioned that after 14 days in the previous ICMR guidelines, that plasma donation can occur after 14 days. So has the current recommendation changed to 28 days, or it can still be taken after 14 days once a patient is symptom free?
Yeah, the 14 days guideline was in the PLACID trial. So at the time of the trial, it was considered that we'll take 14 days, because at that time we were actually taking patients who have RT-PCR negative report at the time of discharge. So we were sure that they didn't were having any virus in their blood, or they were not harboring the virus. So there is a risk that we might infuse a plasma which is having viral particles. So since we have gone away with RT-PCR negative testing at the time of discharge, so a 28 days interval is now recommended. The NBTC guidelines for a blood donor selection also post-COVID recovery says 28 days. So nowadays we are taking 28 days post recovery.
Okay. If you go back to the chat box.
Yes, so the next question is regarding any guidelines regarding use of baricitinib plus remdesivir.
So baricitinib plus remdesivir, there was one RCT published in NEJM which looked at remdesivir alone, compared it with baricitinib plus remdesivir. Baricitinib is a JAK2 inhibitor, and what that study did show was that the combination in moderate to severe COVID-19 patient did lead to a better outcome in terms of oxygen requirement and hospitalization, as far as I remember. This is one RCT only. It was therefore considered by many that it can be used because it is available. This drug is available in our country. There are doctors who are using it off and on in moderate to severe patients, along with the remdesivir, and with the hope that you may not have to escalate or give higher dose of steroids. But it's not in our guidelines because the data still is not strong enough. It's just one trial, and we felt that more data was required. I don't know if there's any experience, Neeraj, if you have anything to add.
Yes, sir. We used it in 2 patients, and unfortunately, the outcome was not as expected. So I think the evidence at the moment is not that strong. And again, baricitinib has its own problem. It's a costly drug. Ability may be an issue. So I think we should not make it another remdesivir and prescribe it left, right, and center to create another problem. At the moment, evidence is very, I will say, weak for its use.
And the evidence that we have is only in combination with remdesivir. It is not a replacement for remdesivir. Some places people have sort of tried to show that if you don't get remdesivir, you can try baricitinib. That data is not there right now, and it is not an it's not an antiviral drug. Okay, let's go down to.
The next one is patients within apparent infection have greater antibody response. So I think generally it has been seen that when the disease is more severe, the antibody response is much better, and collecting from them will give us more high titer plasma. So the evidence is just against what you are asking. So the people who have apparent infection may not have that greater antibody response.
Enough. Let's move ahead. You have. What would be the lowest donor titer for plasma therapy for donations?
Sir, it would depend on the test which one is using. If you are doing viral neutralization assay, then 160 is the one which is recommended. In our country, 80 is recommended by ICMR. And depending on the test, the table I have shown, we can utilize that table actually. Because the titer will depend on assay to assay.
Yes, that's true. Okay, the next question is, if mild disease, why use it?
Yes, sir. We are targeting. We are actually neutralizing the virus. So the less the quantum of the virus, the amount of antibodies which we are giving would be sufficient to neutralize it. If the plasma is used in later stages, the amount of virus will be more as compared to the quantum of antibodies which we are giving. Secondly, the inflammatory response would have already set in, which is not related to treatment with CCP.
Yeah, and the other thing is we're not saying all patients who have mild disease should be given. It's mild to moderate, and the timing of the disease, that it's early in the time frame. So you may have moderate disease with falling oxygen saturation infiltrates, and you may be just on the 5th or 6th day. This is the time when one could consider giving convalescent plasma, because right now your antibodies have not formed, and this is like a passive treatment to be able to decrease viral replication and therefore try and decrease the viral load. So it's not that people who have mild disease and who are maintaining saturation, who are at home, need to give in convalescent plasma. It's actually more towards those who are getting admitted having moderate disease, but early in the phase of disease. There's no point giving it on the 13th or 14th day of patients who have severe illness. I think that is an important point that one needs to understand. Anything else that Dr. Neeraj would like to add, or we?
Like you always say, right drug at right time can save life. So it's we have options with us, but it's the timing. Timing, maybe most of us may not be using it correctly, and that's the reason why the effectiveness of these drugs are not that apparent. And plasma could be just one of those examples. So timing is something which we have to decide, and what type of patient should be given plasma. That I think we have to take a call very soon on that.
Okay, that I think is very, very important, because both two things I think in convalescent plasma are very important. The titers as far as plasma is concerned, and when we give it in terms of the timing. If both things don't match, the efficacy will come down. And I personally feel that the reason why many of these trials were negative was because these two things were not looked at as aggressively as they should be. If you look at even the study in JAMA, some patients got convalescent plasma on the 20th day. If you look at the days that when convalescent plasma was given, it was not going to be useful if you're giving it on 18th, 19th, or 20th day. It was done more out of desperation when patient is very sick, rather than the fact that it would be very helpful. So it's very important that we look at these two things. If you do that, that you have plasma which is truly convalescent plasma in terms of the titers, and you are giving it at the right time to the patient, it will probably be of maximum benefit. Okay, can we move on to the next question? In between, if someone has a question that he wants to ask directly, he can just raise his hand. Okay, I can see one hand which is raised, so please go ahead.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I wanted to know that is regarding the adequacy of the plasma, whether it should be given according to the body weight, because majority of the patients, they are obese. So is there any amount plasma infused according to the body weight?
Routine plasma transfusions are generally given according to body weight because we need to replace a certain level of coagulation in them. However, for CCP transfusions, there are recommendations. Most of the trials have used 200, 250 ml. In our Placid trial, it was in one of our guidelines from ICMR, it was 3 to 7 ml per kg body weight. But again, the availability, since the plasma volume which blood bank prepares is around 200 ml. So if we look at the practicality, it may not be practical. The important thing is that the plasma should have a high titer, and as sir said, it has to be given early in period. So 200 ml also could be sufficient. Although what you said, that can also be explored, because giving according to body weight will make it more rational, ideally. Although there are no guidelines or no recommendations to give it according to body weight right now.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, we can take the next question.
So the next one is, what is cutoff SpO2 for convalescent plasma therapy?
Again, it's not based on the cutoff. You may have, it's based on, like I said, timing. One of the issue is early in the stage of the disease, if you're having fall in oxygen saturation, you have moderate disease, you're admitted, and it's early, then you should consider convalescent plasma. Again, normally we would say 5th to 7th day, moderate illness, having a fall in oxygen saturation, infiltrates appearing in the chest. That is the time that we need to hit hard, and we would consider giving convalescent plasma.
So the next question is, do all labs follow a uniform unit for titers to determine eligibility for donation? Certain labs don't have units mentioned in the antibody report. To answer the first part, no, not everyone writes the titer because the titers are being done in different equipments or different assays. So each assay or each equipment has a different way of expressing those titers. Like if you look at the Abbott assay, it tells the final result in terms of signal cutoff ratio. Now in GenScript, it gives you an inhibition percentage. In Ortho, again, signal cutoff. In ROS, it is COI. In again another assay of ROS, it is IU per ml. So the uniformity is not there because the tests which are being done are of different nature. However, they have a different qualifying result which was qualify them as high titer. So depending on what was the test which was used, you can always define the units to be having high titer or low titer. So you should ask for what test was utilized to actually look for these titers. So based on the number, you can simply find out whether it is high titer or low titer.
Okay, we can go ahead.
So the next one is just a comment. Can I see video on YouTube after live streaming? I think yes. Then the other one is also comment, any data on antibody related enhancement of COVID? No, there are no case reports or there are no information regarding any antibody dependent enhancement for COVID. Then the next one is, suppose a patient's PF ratio is below 100 ARDS and of illness is 5. Should we use CC plasma in this case? Dr. Neeraj might want to answer. So your mic.
Can you repeat what was the PF ratio?
The PF ratio is below 100 severe ARDS and day of illness is 5. Should we use CC plasma in this case?
So again, day 5, patient presenting with ARDS, I will say that the symptom onset has been neglected at the early part. Usually patients don't present with ARDS on day 5. And again, if we use patients with ARDS and plasma, then chances of it not succeeding will be very high and we will say plasma is not working. So I think it won't be an appropriate decision to give plasma in such patients, and I request Maria sir to comment on this.
I would agree with that. That one has to look at it. You see, the other issue is, talking of day 5, it depends on how you calculated day 5. Sometimes patients may tell you that their test is now become positive, and you say this is the day 1. But when you talk to them, they said for the last 4-5 days or maybe even a week, they were having symptoms, they were managing and were scared to get themselves tested. And then later on, after about 5-6 days, they got themselves tested and turned out to be positive. So calculating the day of illness, sometimes one has to do very carefully because it may not be based only on when the RT-PCR became positive. It may also be related to since when the patient was symptomatic. But one has to be careful in such a situation because if this patient has got a PF ratio of less than 100, he has severe ARDS. He has possibly now gone on to more of a cytokine storm or the inflammatory stage where you will have to treat him aggressively. There is limited role, not very much as far as CCP is concerned.
The next question is, D-dimer values will be affected by post-plasma therapy. Yes, some of the trials have looked into this aspect and there was a decrease in D-dimer, but again it increased after a day or so. So I don't know what will be the significance because we are not targeting D-dimer, we are actually targeting the virus here. So we should look at viral load instead of D-dimer here. Sir, if you have any comments, Dr. Neeraj.
So plasma, it could just be a dilutional effect, you may say, but 200 or 250 ml should not be causing that much difference. So I think we have not noticed this type of difference, but next time I think we will be slightly more observant regarding this.
The next one is, will plasma given normal person further prevent for corona? So this was one of the post-exposure prophylaxis or pre-exposure prophylaxis. Yes, it may work, but considering the safety and introducing other infection is another problem with such kind of treatment. Though monoclonal antibodies or serum therapy, like for other diseases, maybe if we develop that, then it may be used for this particular use.
So I think this is something which a lot of people have sort of questioned and said, can close contacts of a COVID positive patient be considered for plasma therapy, that you therefore prevent getting the infection by giving some sort of passive immunity. However, there are side effects with the treatment and we still need to have more data in terms of its utility in this form. There is also studies which are now looking at monoclonal antibodies in a similar fashion. Although currently monoclonal antibodies that have been approved are only for mild disease and are not for those who are admitted or who are hospitalized currently. Both the drugs by Eli Lilly and by the other company, Regeneron, are not currently approved as per the FDA or the European Union, and therefore currently I don't think there is enough evidence to give it for even to normal people, even if they are close contacts.
So the next one is whether neutralizing antibody titration facility available in India. Yes, they are available, though at limited places. However, if there is no titration facility, you can utilize the table for other tests, which is equivalent to those neutralization factors. Shall I move on to next? Yeah. Is there any serious complication of transfusing CCP after 2 to 3 weeks of symptom onset? So I don't think there the risk of transfusion of CCP will be similar across both the groups, whether we are transfusing early or late. Although there won't be any benefit, so the risk-benefit ratio would not actually allow us to use in the later phases. There won't be much benefit because of transfusing in the later period. Shall I move on to next, sir?
Yes, yes. Please go ahead. Go.
What are the most important inflammatory markers? I think Dr. Neeraj can answer this.
So the most important thing will be clinical status of the patient, and then you have to correlate, if required, with the inflammatory markers. So if patient is doing fine, you don't have to look at inflammatory markers. But in case if patient is not doing fine, then you may correlate and maybe get few of the inflammatory markers like CRP, which is an important, I will say, prognostic marker in patients who are not doing well. That is something we can look for. And other markers, you have to correlate with patients. So if you ask which is the most important inflammatory markers, I don't have that answer for that. But if clinical status of the patient, if you are following that properly, then you will be able to make most of the judgment without looking on those markers. So
I just like to add, because I am a firm believer that in biomarkers are currently really misused in this pandemic. We have used biomarkers and they have been used and created panic. In a person who has mild illness, who not much of a problem, and is at home, there is really no need to do biomarkers. And you must understand, many biomarkers will be elevated because they are acute phase reactants. Even if you had a toothache or you had a boil, your CRP will go up. Your many biomarkers will show elevation. So you should not really get perturbed if a person's biomarkers are getting elevated. But as has been said, in moderate illness, they are good markers to really guide you in terms of how aggressive you need to be. And sometimes they have a prognostic role because you can follow up serial biomarkers and see how the patient is doing in terms of the inflammatory response. Many years ago, we looked at CRP in patients with acute exacerbation of COPD, who we were admitting. And we found that those who had a fall in CRP in the 48 hours after admission had much better prognosis as compared to those in whom the CRP continued to be high, even 48 to 72 hours after admission. So serial biomarkers may be useful in seriously ill patients, but in an OPD, in a mild patient, I think biomarkers are grossly misused in today's time. Once a patient is COVID positive, he's asked to get biomarkers done, he's asked to get a CT scan done, and then the whole drama of steroids, anticoagulants, and ecosprin, so many things start, which are actually not required and create more confusion and panic, not only for the physician, but also for the patient. So I think it's important for us to really look at biomarkers critically and when we should do them and when we should not do them. Okay, we can go on to the next question.
Yes, so the next one is effect of interferon alpha B. So I'll pass on to Dr. Neeraj again.
So again, a drug which was used for some other disease, hepatitis B and C, where it has gone out of favor because of availability of better drug, is now being repurposed in the name of this pandemic. So on very limited data, it is being touted as one of the drug which may actually be game changer. Again, just like remdesivir, and we don't agree with that. Even if it has to be used, it should be only in trial setting and not randomly in each and every patient. So we have to be careful, and we should not allow this drug to be used indiscriminately. That's what we feel, and I'm sure Guleria sir will also agree with that.
I totally agree that there is a lot of hype as far as interferons are concerned. Pegylated interferon now has also got some approval from the regulators, but the data is not strong enough to really say it's of much use. There are limited trials, and therefore I don't think we should jump into using it.
So the next one is, though we have got a good, this is from Dr. Smita Mahapatra. Though we have got very good outcome, 83% success rate in Odisha state from CP therapy, clinicians are still hesitant to transfuse it, giving plea of ICMR findings that it is not to be transfused in recipient with IgG antibodies. Further confusion among clinicians after vaccination, it should not be transfused that patient would have developed IgG antibody. And deferral period of donor acceptance can be reduced from 28 days to at least 14 days. Deferral should be counted from either dose of vaccination. So to answer the first one, yes, I would agree with you if you say you have a very good outcome, but what were the controls which were used to actually compare that outcome? So the clinicians would always look at what happened to the controls and what happened with your test arm. So you need to say in comparison to your controls what happened in this particular CP therapy. Then after vaccination, again, if it is given early or after looking for the antibody titer in the patient, because vaccination will also induce IgG antibodies in the patient, stimulate IgG antibodies. So if a patient does not have efficacy after vaccination, if he does not form antibodies after vaccination, then it may be tried in early phases if the clinician deems it fit. However, if there are antibodies already in the patient, then it may not be much useful. Then the deferral period of donor acceptance can be reduced to 28 days to at least 14 days. I think I already covered this part in the presentation that we need to make sure that the plasma does not contain live viral particles which may go into the patient. Although anemia is very rarely observed in plasma, but there is a risk. So we need to take a deferral period of 28 days. Some trials have taken 14 days, considering there is an RT-PCR negative report at the time of discharge. So for that, you need an RT-PCR negative report.
So I think the second question is interesting, and I think it's important for people to really ponder about it, that if you have a person who has been vaccinated and it's 2 weeks after getting the second dose of the vaccine, he has some degree of antibodies that have already been formed, and now he gets COVID-19 infection. Is there a role of giving convalescent plasma in such a situation? And secondly, should you test the person's antibody titer before deciding on convalescent plasma as a part of therapy if he develops moderate COVID-19 infection? Because most of the convalescent plasma trials, even in the past, have been done before vaccines were available for them. So this is a situation where you're saying you're vaccinated, you have already got, we're assuming some degree of antibodies because of the vaccine. Is there now a role of convalescent plasma? So it's an interesting question. I was just wondering what Dr. Hemchandra has to say as far as this is concerned, because I was wondering whether we should look at some new guidelines from this point of view. What should be done in such a situation? Because convalescent plasma guidelines don't address this right now.
Sir, I think it would depend on what vaccine one has actually been administered. Because if we look at the two vaccines which are available in our country, Covishield, for Covishield, there will only be anti-S1S2 antibodies. So if the person does not show S1S2 antibodies, then he may or may not benefit with CCP. We would have to do further trials for that. For inactivated viral vaccine, the antibodies which are there will be very broad in nature, because almost all the antigens which are present in natural infection would be presented to the body, and there will be a mixture of antibodies in the patient. Secondly, the Covaxin currently is designed to stimulate T cell immunity as well. So even if antibodies are not there, the T cell immunity will function in a particular person if he is vaccinated. So we may not require in such scenarios CCP if we are asked. So for Covishield, I'm not sure, but for Covaxin, we may not require.
Okay, it's an interesting scenario. Neeraj, do you have any comments, or we go on to the next question? Okay, we can go on to the next question.
Okay, sir. So the next one is remdesivir use in pregnancy and lactation. Probably Dr. Neeraj might want to answer this.
Most of our pregnant patients have not required remdesivir, and if it is at term delivery, if they have presented a term, if required after delivery, we have used. Though I think OBS and Gynae Society has said that if required, can be used in pregnant patient if the threat to life is more. But again, like I said, remdesivir, we don't know how good it is and how is it going to save life of people. So we have to be judicious while using it, and not all pregnant patients should be given remdesivir just because they have COVID-19. So this is what we follow, and usually once the patient has delivered, if there is some indication, if we feel, then only we use, not in every pregnant patient.
Yes, so I would tend to agree with that. You must take a risk-benefit analysis and see what is the current scenario. There is now more and more data emerging. There's a recent paper which has come in JAMA Pediatrics also, looking at a large number of pregnant women and following them up with COVID infection. And there was another paper I read a few days ago in an obstetric journal. What that these paper, and there is some systemic review also, I think, in Lancet. All of them are trying to show, or have shown, that pregnancy, COVID-19 and pregnancy usually have a poorer outcome. In the early part of the pandemic, we were thinking that pregnancy has a better outcome or doesn't have a worse outcome, unlike H1N1, where there was a worse outcome, and that's why they were on top priority as far as vaccination was concerned. These studies are actually comparing and showing that both from the mother point of view and from fetal outcome, it's not that the outcome is worse as compared to when they compare it with non-COVID pregnant women. And I think therefore we need to be aggressive in treating pregnancy with COVID, unlike what we were doing in the past. And I personally feel that we should aggressively start now considering vaccinating pregnant women also. There is not much data, but most of the societies, if you look at the Royal Society guidelines, if you look at FOXI guidelines, they're all now recommending that you should consider vaccination for pregnant women for COVID-19, although the regulatory authorities have not approved it. So it's something important for us to keep in mind, because I feel that there is now gradually data emerging that pregnant women having COVID-19 infection may have an outcome which is worse than those those pregnant women who did not get COVID-19. Also, I feel that it's very important to aggressively push for COVID appropriate behavior in families where there is a pregnant lady, because we must try and protect them as much as possible.
So the next question is from Devapriya Basu. Is there any data with Trans-Asia Arbalisa IgG COVID-19 antibody for discriminating high and low titer? Unfortunately, there is no data regarding this particular assay. So you need to actually validate this assay before you use this assay. The next question is from Dr. Satyam Arora. Any experience of use of CCP in pediatric or neonates with comorbidity, as most of the drugs are not allowed in that age group? So Dr. Neeraj, would you like to answer?
Best of my knowledge, we have not used it in any of our pediatric patients so far. So we don't have any data on that.
So the next one is how to choose between CCP and remdesivir. Dr. Neeraj, if you...
Neeraj can answer that.
Yes, sir.
So again, the timing of use of plasma and remdesivir may actually coincide, because that is the only part where both of them may show benefit. That is early moderate disease, where patient has just started desaturating, oxygen requirement has started, the infiltrates are just appearing. So these are the group of patients which may benefit. So timing basically is almost similar in the early part of moderate disease.
The next one is, will advise to go for antibody titer measurement before donation. I would say that one should look for the presence of antibodies if they are there, because most of the titration assays will take time for the result to come, and the donor may not wait for that long. So we may collect the plasma, and depending on presence or absence of antibodies, and then we can do the titration later on. So if the titer are low, then it can be used as a routine plasma. There are no guidelines against using such low titer plasma as a routine plasma. So it may be used for that, or it may be utilized, given to fractionators to form monoclonal antibodies if they are doing, they are actually working on that. So before donation, there is no need to do antibody titration. However, it can be done later on. So shall I move on to the next one? Do we need to increase the dose of heparin post plasma therapy? I don't think there is need, because 200 ml plasma is not going to cause much coagulation changes. I think this was post thrombotic event, which when we discuss that post thrombotic, the comment would most likely be after that. The next one is, in Placid trial, PF ratio was between 200 to 300. Do we take into account now?
So it only shows that the early moderate disease are going to benefit. So if you clinically judge, then perhaps this will be the group of patients which may benefit from use of plasma therapy. So you have to use your clinical judgment and then take a call. So this should not be just the exact cutoff, but yeah, these group of patients are expected to have maximum benefit.
The next one is from Dr. Dharmendra. Is there any prophylactic role of plasma in COVID-19? We already discussed this, I think, as pre-exposure. Yes, the next one is from Ajay Kumar Behra. If a patient had received plasma therapy and recovered from COVID-19, what is the ideal time to get vaccinated for COVID? I don't think there is any relation with plasma therapy, although it may be timed. The infection can be considered as the first dose of vaccine, and the second dose can be timed to 4 to 6 weeks later, because this vaccination first dose will act as a booster of the infection. So that may be ideal. I think sir might like to answer this.
No, what was the question? I still haven't found the question.
If a patient had received plasma therapy and recovered from COVID-19, what is the ideal time to get vaccinated for COVID?
So the ideal time for vaccination that has been mentioned in our guidelines say that you must have recovered, and there should be a gap of at least 2 weeks, 14 days before you take your vaccine. We normally recommend patients to take it after 14 days, could even take it after 4 to 6 weeks. But the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare guidelines says that wait for at least 14 days after full recovery before you take the vaccine.
The next one is from AIMS Raipur. Considering the risk of TRALI, is it worth to give CCP in mild disease? Generally, we are actually excluding donors, multiparous female donors, which are usually associated with TRALI. So the risk could be very less in our case.
We are not using plasma in mild patient anyway at the moment. So again, so we should actually choose our patient accordingly. So we are not using it into mild patient.
How long will effect of CCP last?
So
I think the
Go ahead, Neeraj, go ahead.
yes, sir.
So again, the time, how long will it last? Again, the antibody will neutralize virus if antibody is sufficient and virus viremia is there. Apart from that, how long the effect will last is something it's really difficult to say, but maybe 24 to 48 hours, and after that, and that's one of the reasons why perhaps the repeat dose of plasma wherever indicated is to be given after 48 hours, considering okay, this will be effective for at least 48 hours. So, sir, if you want to add.
I agree with that totally. That's what I was going to just add, that sometimes people give more than one dose of plasma, and usually you give it after 48 hours because that you feel that that is the time when the first dose will be effective. So it's going to be only for a short duration as far as neutralization is concerned, and not something which will last for many days.
Then another question from Dr. Satyam Arora. Some countries have considered use of CCP for mild cases in daycare fashion. Any opinion? I don't agree with this because we have to monitor the patient even if we are transfusing a blood component, and there might be reactions later after the patient is discharged. So we cannot give this kind of therapy, at least in our country. The next one is I tested COVID positive a week after my second dose of Covaxin on 5/4/21, tested negative on 16/4. I am 59 hypertensive. Can I be a CCP donor? I tested positive on second. Yes, definitely. If you have a natural infection, then you can be a CCP donor. Yes. Then Dr. Neeraj Gupta has asked one question. AIMS guidelines are published on MOHFW. Can doctors follow these with confidence? Are these evidence-based?
So I can just say that these guidelines are both being looked at very critically, not only by AIMS, but by the National Task Force and by the Joint Monitoring Group, which is under the DGHS. And a lot of time was spent going through the entire literature review of each of the points that we raised. I'm not saying that these are the final document. These are live documents. They will change as evidence keeps coming in. But as of now, they are definitely evidence-based.
Sir, the next question is regarding whether Trump received monoclonal antibodies or not. So I'm not aware whether he received any.
So Trump did receive monoclonal antibodies from, I think, from Regeneron.
Okay, so role. The next one is role of rising CRP in pregnancy in mild disease. So your mic is off.
Role of?
Rising CRP in pregnancy in mild disease.
So again, even pregnancy can cause increase in CRP. We have to remember that. So if the patient is perfectly fine, doing fine, all you should do is monitor it closely. That's why, as sir rightly said in the start only, and it has to be re-emphasized that if patient is perfectly fine, mild symptoms, then we should not be chasing lab values. We should closely monitor the patients and then take a call based on that rather than just following CRP values.
Okay. The next one is any role of ivermectin or doxycycline.
So we discussed it yesterday also. Role of ivermectin, again, theoretically it has a virucidal effect against SARS-CoV-2 virus, though the blood level required for this to be effective in us is much higher. But considering that it's a relatively safe drug and there are some evidence that it might be actually helpful, so that's why using it in mild patient may not be that difficult, and I think it's relatively safe and cheap medicine. That's why It has been recommended. Even if it has some benefit, it will benefit a lot of people. Doxycycline routinely is not part of our recommendation. If you are suspecting any other atypical pneumonia based on the clinical picture and you are not able to prove that, then one may use it, but it's not a part of treatment protocol of COVID-19. That needs to be reinforced.
Okay, sir. The next one is a comment that the webinar has to be done in Hindi, it seems, sir. So,
Okay, we can take this up with the ministry and see what they, how do they
yes,
feel.
sir. Okay, sir. So the next 2-3 questions are again repetition of what has already been discussed. The other one is, can you advise on home management of mild disease in insulin-dependent diabetic patients?
Yes, so I'll just like to mention here that we are planning to have one whole session on diabetes, because two things are what we're observing. One is, of course, many patients now on home are being put on steroids, and because many patients are at home are being put on steroids, and steroid use during this second wave has really gone up as compared to what we were doing in the past. A lot of individuals are developing high blood sugars, or who are known diabetics are developing erratic blood sugar values, and there is a need for everyone, including people at a ground level, even at a primary level, to understand how should you manage blood sugars in such a situation where you're landing up giving steroids, sometimes relatively high dose, and then once the patient is being discharged, what do you do if the patient has been put on insulin? Do you discharge on insulin? Do you convert back to OHAs? So we will have one session in the coming days on this topic, because I was thinking that this is something it's very important for us to discuss, especially now with the such high use of steroids. I would say use and misuse of steroids in the current pandemic wave.
The next question is from Dr. S.K. Mishra. From day of COVID onset, on which day is one eligible to donate plasma? So it is not from the day of COVID onset, but it is from the day of discharge. 28 days from the day of discharge, whether if asymptomatic, then on 10th day you are considered to be non-infective, or so from 10th day or from the day which one is discharged, you can actually calculate the day which one is eligible to donate. So the next one is, what is the indication of steroids in COVID? I request Dr. Neeraj to answer.
Yeah, so this was discussed yesterday, and I think we should stick to plasma therapy in this webinar. So again, role of steroid is basically if patient has landed into cytokine storm, or if we are seeing that the patient has started desaturating, fever is persisting beyond 7-8 days, and so we have to take into account all these aspects. And this was discussed yesterday, so one can visit that link of yesterday and see these things. So let's stick to the plasma therapy aspect.
Okay. The next one has already been discussed regarding advice on safe period when vaccination can be initiated post-COVID. I think sir has already addressed this. The next one is, can antibodies produced due to vaccination will be working as neutralizing antibody? If no, then CCP has role in vaccinated person. So antibodies post-vaccination, we do not know what are the antibodies which are formed, or are they similar in nature to the ones which are formed due to natural infection. So we cannot use them actually as neutralizing antibodies. CCP may have a role, but still it's a topic for discussion. Then, can pregnant and lactating women be immunized? I think sir has already given his views on this. Then, can vaccine be given to patients like cerebral palsy?
So if I just add this, that we had a group which was formed to look at comorbidities for which vaccinations should be given. This was done a few months ago as part of the mandate given to us by the NEGVAC, and we had made criteria for comorbidities, which included patient, and this group which I and the former DG Dr. Rajiv Garg was chairing, had people from pediatrics, from nephrology, from endocrinology, and from various specialties, and from the disability group. And patients with cerebral palsy or patients who were mentally challenged were also added in this group. So cerebral palsy is one high priority group which needs to be vaccinated.
Most of the next questions are repeat of what we have already discussed. The next one is there a role of pooled plasma or should CCP be single donor only? So I feel it would be single donor only as we require 200 ml and it can be easily collected either by cell separator or by whole blood collection. So there is no need to pool plasma because it will lead to introduction of infections or other complications from multiple blood donors. So only single plasma should be used. Pooled plasma should not be used in this process. Then as per ICMR guideline, now we can collect CCP after 24 days of recovery and RT-PCR negative report is not required. Can we follow this or can we collect only after 28 days in this case? I don't remember it being 24 days, still it is 28 days only. If you are collecting 28 days post recovery, then you need not have a RT-PCR negative report. The next is role of pulse dose steroids.
I think these are questions which probably were discussed yesterday also, if I'm not mistaken. And as what I can make out is most of the questions that are being asked now are something which are more generic. We have tried to answer most of them. Can lactating women receive vaccination? Is something that we've discussed both in terms of pregnancy and lactation, and vaccination in pregnancy. So these are not related to current topic, but we have tried to address many of them. So I think more or less all the questions have been addressed as of now. And some of them were even addressed yesterday, which are being asked today. So you could even look at the link and see the discussion that was done yesterday also. So more or less, I think we have covered the entire topic and we've taken up all your questions in the chat box. If there's any final question that you want to ask, you can raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll request Mr. Love Agarwal from the ministry to give his comments before we wind up.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. Sorry that I could only join late. But again, my thanks are due to all the colleagues who have joined in this webinar on the third topic for discussion today. I have only one request to make. As I had told in our initial discussions earlier with all our regional centers also, that now is the time to demystify COVID treatment. And this is the time where the whole COVID treatment should go to each and everyone in the country, from a ANM to a PSC doctor to government/private doctor, everywhere everyone should know what this COVID treatment is. Because the panic which has set in, the doubts which are getting set in, and with larger number of cases coming up in 2-tier towns and 2-3-tier towns, if we do not do it as early as possible, there will be a lot of confusion at field level. Second point, I would like to request particularly our Center of Excellences from state which are present here. We had clearly requested that even if COVID RT-PCR test reports are getting delayed, kindly do not refuse patient is the message which has to clearly go down. If clinical symptoms are there, the guidelines for COVID management are very clear. The patient can be, after triaging, can be kept in a suspect ward and given the requisite treatment as far as the COVID-19 management is concerned. Because right now what is happening with larger number of cases coming up, there are times when people are not even able to either get their test done, or even if they are going to get their test done, they are not able to get the report for 3 to 5 days. And in the meantime, the whole condition of the patient deteriorates. I will give you a concrete example of yesterday only. A person who is a driver based in Delhi could not get his test done. And since he could not get his test done, last 4 days, his condition deteriorated and his oxygen saturation came to 80. Now we are probably complicating the situation if there are delays like that. So yes, there will be constraint and there will be effort to ensure that higher testing is ensured. But considering this framework, it is important that the patient gets the requisite treatment ASAP. Second specific request I would like to make, which Dr. Saab, you had highlighted yesterday in media also, the fear amongst people that everyone has to get their CT scan to be done, inflammation markers to be checked. This is not needed. I can tell you, Dr. Neeraj Nishchal, I see whatever treatment, simple 5 points he had sent to me, I would have given it to hundreds of patients and all of them recovered. And none of those are very hi-fi treatment. None of those are hi-fi testings which are there. It is all about early identification, initiating early treatment, what is the key, and taking adequate rest. I'm sure all of you know it more than me. Third point I would like to request now, when the third lecture series is going on, it is important that the Center of Excellence at state level, in collaboration with our regional Center of Excellence, should start making the district level training plan of action for the states which are in their area. We need to take it down to masses. We need to take it down to every doctor in the country. So this is what is the need of the hour. I would request particularly all our colleagues from regional centers as well as our state center of excellences to start talking to their secretary health to make that plan. Some states are already doing it. I was told that there are some states where still they would need cooperation from the state secretary health. If there are such issues, kindly let us know. We will talk to those secretary health to see that that action plan gets made. But it has to go down to masses is what is our request. And I know that already a lot of time has elapsed, so we will not take much time. And the only thing I can tell you is that our sincere thanks are due to you. We know how much hard work is being put up by the medical fraternity, and you are our major hope and support. We know that. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you very much. And I think we have to really work to make sure that this is then percolated down, right down to the rural level, to the primary health level. The main aim for all of this is basically to be able to reach out to every doctor in at a rural level, at whether he's be in the private sector or in the government sector. So please, let's start working in that direction, and we at the All India Institute would help you in whatever way we can. So I think if we are able to do that, then we would have succeeded in trying to really save lives and provide evidence-based treatment and be able to explain why this treatment is needed in terms of the right drug at the right time, and why things should not be done which are of no use, including CT scans. Thank you very much. Tomorrow we will have a discussion on another very important topic, which is oxygen therapy without invasive ventilation. And I think this is becoming more and more important because there is also a lot of misuse of oxygen which is going on. Therefore, to understand when to use oxygen, when not to use oxygen, and how to use it is something that is very, very important. We'll discuss this tomorrow. But I think it's very important for all the centers of excellence, the state and the regional centers, to start developing plans so that as cases increase in their area, they're able to educate people about proper use of oxygen so that it doesn't get wasted.
Dr. Saab, I have a small quick point if I can raise. When we are talking about oxygen therapy tomorrow, do you advise that depending on time, we talk to some TV channels to show it live?
We can do that, but you will have to get the link done. AIIMS can probably not get the TV channels on board. I'm sure ministry has much more influence.
No, I totally take your point. Let me ask our IC division if they can do that. And then the Echo platform people, if they can coordinate among themselves to do this exercise, because with this, at least even if Doordarshan picks it up and the whole thing gets recorded through Doordarshan, it goes to masses. And then maybe 4 p.m. we can talk about it. We can say that it is coming up at this time, and if need be, we can even delay tomorrow's this thing, post the VC, post our press conference, etc. I think I'll discuss with you, take your guidance on that to plan it further, please.
Okay, we can do that. We can do that.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. I really need to thank Dr. Hemchandra Pandey today because he gave an excellent talk on convalescent plasma, and of course my colleague Dr. Neeraj Nishchal for being there to answer all the questions that we took up, which were also more generic and related to plasma. If still you have any questions that you think you wanted to ask and you were not able to ask, please feel free to send us a mail. We would be more than happy to answer those. And as we discussed in the beginning, all the questions we could collate and make them into an FAQ, which also one could distribute to the doctors at a regional level. And we could even convert them into regional language so that it's easier for doctors at that level to be able to answer these questions. So thank you very much. And I think if there's any final comments from Rajiv, otherwise we can close.
No, thank you, sir. We've actually gone on pretty long today. It's been 2 hours, so that's just far more than what we had budgeted. But that's good. You've answered a lot of questions, including what was asked every day. I saw him trying desperately to run through the entire list, which is simply impossible. So great job done, and we'll back tomorrow for the oxygen therapy without ventilation. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.